Hey, welcome to the exam marking video for the exam on national and global energy resources. So, make sure you've got your blue and green pen ready. You're writing the answers in green and annotations in blue. So, first question. Iceland is a country that generates most of its electricity using geothermal power stations and hydroelectric power stations. So make a note in blue pen what kind of energy resources they both are. They are both renewable energy resources, so write that in with the blank filled in. Complete the following sentences to describe how some geothermal power stations work. In regions where volcanoes are active, the ground is hot. Cold water is pumped down into the ground and is heated by hot rocks. Instead of the word heated, you could put boiled or turned to steam. It returns to the surface as steam, and the steam is used to turn a turbine, and the turbine drives a generator. And the way to remember that is whenever you have electricity, the step before will always be a generator is turned or driven, because it links to generating electricity. So that's worth 3 marks, 1 for each of the correct blanks. Which one of the following statements about geothermal power stations is true? You're meant to tick only one box. And the correct answer is that geothermal power stations provide a reliable source of electricity. It is not true that they use fossil fuels. That would be a coal, oil or natural gas power station. And they don't produce carbon dioxide because no fuels are burnt. You're simply pumping water down into the earth. It gets heated by the earth's hot rocks, and then the steam that's produced turns a turbine, which turns a generator. The reason it's reliable is because hot rocks are always hot and it doesn't change over time. It's always going to be hot. So write that down in blue pen. What is needed for hydroelectric power stations to generate electricity? Well, falling water. You don't need the other two. Those are for other sources. So sunny days for solar, and you might need a long coastline if you're using wave power, for example. Okay, turning over the next question shows a pie chart with the proportion of electricity generated from different energy sources in 2010. Now we know that pie charts always add up, or they sum to 100%. Calculate the percentage of electricity using fossil fuels. So we know there are 3 fossil fuels. Make a note of which ones they are: coal, oil and natural gas. Remember that oil is crude oil. And the answer is, in this case, there is no oil, but there is gas and coal, which you can add up to make 77% of that pie chart is fossil fuels. The pie chart shows that 7% was generated using renewable energy resources. You're asked to tick one box that is not renewable, and the answer is oil, because that is a fossil fuel and therefore is non-renewable, is what you need to write there. Both of these are renewable and so therefore will never run out. Complete the following sentence. In some types of power station, fossil fuels are burned or combusted to heat water to produce steam, and that is true for any power station where there's a fuel. You always either burn it if it's coal, oil or gas, or you're using nuclear fission if it's nuclear, and the energy released from that heats water to produce steam. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is harmful because one box should be ticked: carbon dioxide causes global warming. We know that it's a greenhouse gas. Acid rain isn't caused by carbon dioxide. That's caused by either sulfur dioxide or nitrogen dioxide, or nitrogen oxide in fact as well. And visual pollution, that might be caused by carbon particulates or soot, and that can link to global dimming. Number 3, the world's biggest offshore wind farm, and a wind farm is just lots of wind turbines, built off the Kent coast, started generating electricity in September 2010. One advantage is that it is renewable energy. Give one other advantage of using wind. to generate electricity? Well, there's a couple. It doesn't release greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide, or any other harmful gases for that matter, such as sulfur dioxide. It does not contribute to global warming as a result, and is free once it's set up, because there are no fuel costs. If you said any one of those, you can give yourself a mark. 3AII. Name one other renewable energy source used to generate electricity. So we have, there's a range of them you could have put. Anyone is correct from this list here. Okay, next question. There's a graph to show how wind speed affects the power output of a large wind turbine. So that's our caption. Then look at the axes and just look for a brief trend. So we can see that as the wind speed increases, as it gets windier and windier, we get more and more power output, although it takes a decent amount of wind, maybe around between maybe 0 and 5, so maybe between 3 or 4 meters per second of wind to actually get the turbine going. And in fact we can see that every 2 boxes represents 1, so this would be 1, 2, 3 onwards, you get some energy generated. If it gets too windy, then there's a limit that you reach in terms of how much power output there is, and then any windier than that and you don't get any power output at all. The maximum power output, remember we're looking at the power output as our y-axis, the highest possible amount is 3000 kilowatts. Then there's a newspaper article on the next question. It says, cold weather stops turbines. For the past 2 weeks, most of the UK's wind turbines have been generating less than 1/6 of their maximum power. Now we've just worked out the maximum power was 3000 kilowatts, and this is 1/6 or less that they are now producing in terms of power. So I've done a quick calculation to tell myself only 500 kilowatts are being generated. To avoid major power cuts in the future, some experts have said more nuclear power stations need to be built to provide a reliable source of energy. So obviously wind is unreliable, this is nuclear might be more reliable. That's what the article is suggesting. Use the graph to explain why the power output from the wind turbines was less than 1/6 of the maximum. So I need to make sure I use the graph and I explain why it was less than 1/6. So if I look at my graph, I'll see that if I'm producing less than a sixth of my power output, that means I must be producing less than 500 kilowatts of power. So that's one mark. And the second mark is for saying, therefore, the wind must have been really slow, or there must have been less than 6 meters a second of wind. And those are your 2 marks. So the wind speed is below 6 meters per second, and saying that that's too slow, and you're generating less than 500 kilowatts. So now I've used the graph, so I've got some data from the graph, and I've explained why it was less than 1/6, because I've looked at 500 kilowatts and found out it was lower speed than 6 meters per second. Next question. Having more nuclear power stations will help avoid power cuts in the future. So this is, instead of wind, we want nuclear power. Which 2 of these reasons explains why? So you need to put 2 boxes that you tick. And the correct answers are: a small amount of nuclear fuel generates a large amount of energy. So even if you have a very small amount of nuclear fuel, this is really good because you can actually generate lots of electricity, and that's going to help avoid power cuts. And the second way to avoid power cuts is that it does not depend on weather. So even if the weather is really bad, it doesn't mean I will stop generating electricity, so it's more reliable. Next question. Coal, oil and gas and wood are all examples of fuels. What are fuels? Well, fuels are sources of energy. They contain a store of energy that is released when the fuel, in this case coal, oil, gas and wood, when they are burned or combusted, they release the energy. Now you need to fill in the table to decide which is renewable and non-renewable out of these four, and you just need to know these facts. Wood is renewable because you can always chop down a tree, use the wood, and then grow some more, so they can be replaced. Coal, oil and gas take millions of years to form because they are fossil fuels and they will run out one day. We're very close to actually running out a lot of these. Now you need to think about resources used to generate electricity that are not fuels, and the only one here that's non-renewable is nuclear, because the nuclear fuel will run out one day, or a source of nuclear fuel will run out one day. Whereas the others, this relies on the heat from the earth, never going to run out, the sun's not going to run out, the tides won't stop, and the wind won't stop, so they're all renewable. 4C. Why is it better to use more renewable energy resources rather than non-renewable resources? Well, the problem with non-renewable ones, and we can look at this list to help us, is that they all produce pollution. So coal, oil and gas might produce lots of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides for example, and nuclear fuels produce radioactive waste which pollutes the environment. The second thing is that the energy supply will last longer if it's renewable, because these will never run out, whereas these will run out. And so that links any two of these things you mentioned would give you 2 marks. Next, question number 5, you're asked to explain the advantages and disadvantages of using nuclear power stations to produce electricity. Well, the first advantage is that it is reliable. It is reliable because if you have the fuel, you can definitely generate electricity. If you compare that to something like wind, if the wind stops blowing, even if you have your wind turbine ready, it will not generate electricity, and so it is not reliable. There's a large power output per kilogram of fuel. So a small amount of fuel gives you lots of energy, lots of power. 3. With nuclear fuel, we don't produce greenhouse gases or sulfur dioxide, and that means we won't contribute to global warming, and we won't contribute to acid rain or breathing problems. The disadvantages is that it does produce dangerous or radioactive waste. You could use either word there. And it stays radioactive for thousands of years, which is why it's a problem. It's expensive to decommission. Now that word just means shut down the power station, because after a certain number of years it might be necessary to shut down the power station, but it can be very expensive for nuclear power stations. And thirdly, it's non-renewable. There's a limited supply of nuclear fuels that we can use in nuclear power stations. The final question is about the use of hydroelectric power versus coal power, and you're given quite a bit of information and you're asked to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the two. So, the first thing, the advantage of using, two advantages of using hydroelectric power are that it's renewable, again, which is not true of coal. There's no air pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, very similar to the other question. And there's no fuel costs, because we're not using a fuel here, you're relying on the rains to fill up a body of water, which you then release, generating electricity. The disadvantages are that it does rely on rainfall to fill up those dams, so that when the dam is released, you generate electricity. So it's not as reliable as coal, which you can always, if you need more fuel, you can always burn more coal. Whereas if you suddenly need more fuel with hydroelectric, then, and if it hasn't rained, you can't do that. It destroys habitats. To build this dam, you must have destroyed a big habitat and that might affect the wildlife species living there. And it also is very costly to set up, and that's the final main disadvantage of hydroelectric power stations. There are a few other advantages and disadvantages I'm going to briefly discuss that I have here. With hydroelectric power, you have a short startup time, so you can quickly start to generate electricity. You can store some water for later use. If you suddenly need some electricity, you can store some water for later use. And you could link no sulfur dioxide to no acid rain. Okay, so what you should do now is add up your marks out of 30 and put the number at the front of your exam.